Thanks for coming. My talk is called Walking a Mile in Your User's Shoes. And the first thing I want to do is just introduce myself real fast. My name is Jameson Hampton. You can call me Jamie. I'm here from Buffalo, New York. That's the home of bad sports. I'm really pleased to be here. I love RailsConf. This is my third RailsConf in a row. It's my first time in Minneapolis. I'm representing Agrolist. That's the company I work for. I'm a professional plant liker there. Actually, I'm a software engineer. I'm going to talk more about Agrolist later in the talk, so I'm not really going to go into it right now. I'm also representing Greater Than Code. That's the podcast that I'm on. If you haven't heard of it, it's really great. It's about tech, but it's really about like kind of the people that are behind the tech, because we think that that part's really important. So if you've heard of it, that's great. If you haven't heard of it, check it out. If you have heard of it, we're actually doing a birds of feather discussion with some of the panelists from Greater Than Code today at 3:30. So maybe come check that out if you're interested. I'm also on Twitter at JamieBash. I love Twitter, so totally find me. You can live tweet. My only thing that I want to mention is that I use they, them pronouns. So if you talk about me publicly, please keep that in mind. So when I started writing this talk, I started kind of thinking about like traits that programmers have, or maybe traits that make a good programmer. And when I was in college, I have a minor in computer science, and in one of my like first 101 CS classes, my professor told me that there were two traits that good programmers have. The first is being scared of bugs, and the second is being lazy. And I thought that was really funny that he was saying that like being lazy is a good trait. But when I think about it, I think in some ways being lazy like does make us good programmers, because we want to write reusable code instead of writing things over and over. We want to write scripts instead of doing manual tasks. We find these workarounds, and it's because we work very efficiently because we don't want to do any more work than we have to do. So I kind of like that. But I also think that there are things about that laziness. There's like a flip side of that. I think that sometimes we forget that the things we're doing like aren't as easy for other people as they are for us. Not everyone can just write a script instead of doing something tedious. And so we implement all of these workarounds into our workflow, but we forget that what we're doing is like actually workarounds and not like the real thing. And so I want to propose a third trait, good trait for programmers, which is empathy. This is kind of a talk about user empathy. So what does that mean? Well, the definition of empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of someone else. And I was reading a lot about empathy while I was writing this talk, and it's kind of, people have split it up into three kinds of empathy. There's social empathy. That's that idea that you can sense how someone else is feeling. That's not so much what I'm going to talk about today. But then there's cognitive empathy. This is like the awareness and the understanding of someone else's perspective. And that's kind of where this phrase, like walking a mile in someone else's shoes, comes from, understanding their perspective. And that also includes like using language that another person understands so that you're communicating well. And then the third thing is empathetic concern. This is the idea that like if something is wrong, maybe I sense that and I can feel it, but not only that, I also want to help. I want to do something about it. And so that's kind of, what we're going to talk about, I guess. This isn't actually really a feelings talk. I think feelings talks are extremely good. But I'm going to talk kind of about like examples on the job and with requirements gathering. So I'm going to start talking about like tech and what does it mean to work in tech. Or perhaps a better question is like, what's the difference between like being a technologist and actually working in the tech industry? Because code is code. Everyone needs applications in all sorts of industries. Once you know how to write code, realistically, you can do it for anyone who needs code, which is most people. I can use my background in software engineering to work as a technologist, but in other industries. Here are some of the industries that I've done work in. I'm in agriculture right now. I'm going to talk about that. And really, in most of them, like the hard skills I was using in very similar ways, regardless of what I was actually working on. Being able to choose, this is a perk, by the way. Like being able to choose what industry you want to go work in is a huge privilege, because like it means that I have this opportunity to go and find a job that's where I'm doing something I really care about, like something that I think is actually really important. And I've worked at some jobs that didn't feel like that, and I've worked at some that did. So that's a privilege. But like if code is code, you're saying to me, Jamie, if code is code, then why does it matter which industry you're working in? What's the difference? And my answer to that is because of the user base that you're programming for. So let's say hypothetically, maybe you work at Stack Overflow. I want to make a couple notes. I'm going to talk about a bunch of demographic stuff. I'm using Stack Overflow as my example mainly because they do their yearly developer survey, which means they have like really in-depth data about their demographics. The other thing I want to say before I like launch into this is that like there's a lot of things in the demographics that I'm about to go over that I'm going to categorize as objectively bad. Like I could do a whole talk about why they're bad. That's not exactly the point I'm trying to get at today, so I'm kind of just like acknowledging the elephant in the room. Like some of the demographics of developers like have some problems. We're going to acknowledge it, and then we're going to kind of continue what we're talking about. And I have the gender one up already, so you might have an idea of what I mean when I say that. It's like very overwhelmingly male. I also have this one about race and ethnicity, also pretty overwhelmingly white. I don't have time to like leave all of these graphs up for super long, but I am going to post the slides after if you want to look at them. The age one is really interesting to me because of the way it kind of has this bell curve in the middle, but like 25 to 34 years old is like a huge percentage of the Stack Overflow user base. This one's super interesting to me. This is your parents' highest education level. This was one that I hadn't even really thought about when I like started researching this and writing this talk. But this idea of having this privilege of like growing up middle class or higher is like a very real thing. I'm actually not even like specifically trying to get at the concept of privilege here, although it is a huge factor. But I guess here's what I am trying to get at. Like, what do we notice when we look at some of these demographics? Maybe they look a little bit like us. I mean, not exactly. Like for me, I'm a gender minority. In fact, according to that chart, I'm a less than 1% gender minority. So the first chart didn't look like me. But I guess the point that I'm getting at is that like I live a life that's very similar to the lives that many other developers live. But why does it matter if the demographics look like us or not? Well, when we build applications, we're thinking about what's going to feel intuitive. And if you work in like a tech industry job like Stack Overflow or GitHub, and your application feels intuitive to you, maybe it's a pretty safe bet to guess that it's going to be intuitive also to most of your users, because we're coming from this shared background where we're similar in that way. But what about in other industries where the demographics are different? Like I mentioned, I'm going to talk about this more, but I work in agriculture. So I read the 2012 Department of Agriculture Census, which was a riveting read. And I have some charts from that too. As you can see, agriculture also has a gender problem, but it's actually not as bad as the one in tech. And it's got this kind of chart where it talks about principal, second, and third. Like so, you can see that like there's more women in agriculture, but like less who are running entire farms. This is the race and ethnicity chart, some of it. This is farms that are like owned and run by people of color, and that's increasing, particularly with Hispanic folks. I do want to note that this is principal operators. This is like the person that runs the entire farm. So you are seeing that number increasing, but also this isn't like explicitly getting at the percentages for like all agricultural workers, which is going to look like a lot less white than even we're talking about here, and definitely than in tech. These charts are wild compared to the Stack Overflow one, the age ones. The Stack Overflow chart, like there's like a little bitty one at the end that was like 65 plus, and that's like half of this. And age is a huge factor when it comes to how someone interacts with technology, like way more than gender or race. This is a chart of what percentage of people have internet access, and the fact that there's even a chart for what percentage of people have internet access says a lot about like the very different demographic that we're dealing with. I do want to call myself out a little bit because I just use the word user like a lot of times. And I really love this tweet. A rule to live by: don't replace people with abstractions. They're not users, they're people who are using your tools to do their job. The web is not made of content, it's a collection of human ideas. And this kind of really gets at what I want to say about empathy. Like, this isn't just, nobody's behind a screen. Like, this is real people who are actually trying to do this, like, in their lives. I think it's really hard to have these kind of discussions without examples, so let's do examples. I'm going to do a whole bunch of examples, actually. So this is my first kind of case study. MediCapt is a project that I worked on. I was in consulting before I got my job at AgriList, and so this was a project that I led when I was a consultant. And MediCapt is an Android app that was designed to be used in third world countries to help prosecute sexual offenders. It was commissioned by this NGO called Physicians for Human Rights, and it was an amazing project. Basically, the premise of it is if someone gets assaulted, it's very likely that she's going to go have like a medical exam for like health reasons, even though it's like very invasive to have this exam. But then if she wanted to report the assault to the authorities, she'd likely have to undergo like additional invasive exams to get all the evidence. So that's obviously a huge factor in why crimes were going unreported, which was a huge problem. So this is kind of trying to solve this problem of reporting. And so this idea is that if doctors could like take this examination that they were doing anyway, record it in a way that would be admissible as evidence into the court system, then at the end of this process, they could, like, all that the woman would have to do is consent to reporting. They'd be like, we already have everything we need. All you have to do, if you want, we can like report it, and you don't have to do anything else, and you don't have to go through any more pain. So this is what I mean when I say that you have an opportunity to work on something that you find actually really important. I felt really good about working on this project. And also, it was a very interesting project additionally. So I went into it, it was like, this is, I've never worked on anything like this before. There's going to be challenges. And so I thought about what challenges I thought I was going to face working on this project. There were a lot of privacy concerns since it was sensitive medical data. So we were going to do this custom PIN system where like every time you put the phone down and pick it up, you have to re-enter the PIN so someone can't like steal it in the hospital. Most apps that take pictures like store the photos on the camera roll as well as in the app, and we like overrode that, so they're like not actually stored on the phone anywhere, like only in the database. We were worried about chain of custody, which is kind of a legal thing, this idea that like you want to track who saw these documents and when and have proof about it. So we have this digital paper trail we were going to do, and we did. And we also knew that it was going to be used mainly in Africa, in places where there wasn't necessarily like reliable internet. So we're like, okay, we'll do like a NoSQL thing. We'll rely on eventual consistency. We basically built it so like they could create new records while they were offline. They got stored locally in the phone temporarily, but then when they did connect to the internet, it would sync the records to the database and delete them off the phone. So what I notice about this list is that all of these things are pretty high tech, and the solutions are all very high tech. So this is obviously a list that was written by a programmer. Also, it felt like a very unique project to me, but none of these challenges are really inherently unique. It was a little bit unique because I was dealing with them like all at once, but like having constraints is part of any writing any app or doing any programming. So it was just kind of like these specific constraints. And then after I was working on it for a little while, I I had the opportunity to go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where it was the first place they were going to launch this. It was a really incredible and eye-opening experience. I got to spend time with the people from the NGO. I got to spend time with the doctors. I saw a lot of amazing things. And it completely changed how I was thinking about the project. Like once I saw the situation there and I actually worked with some of the doctors who were there, I realized that there was this entire other set of challenges that like hadn't even occurred to me, because like I'm a programmer and I live in the first world, and like I just couldn't even conceptualize what things were like for the people who were going to use my app. So these are some of the challenges that I actually faced that were, you know, more challenging than I expected. There was a lack of resources, not just internet. For instance, they wanted to do printing, but they didn't have printers in the hospitals. In fact, there were areas that didn't even have reliable electricity. It would like go out for days. And so this was the first time I realized, like, okay, this is really going to require like out-of-the-box thinking, because you can't just like magic up more electricity. I had a very inexperienced user base. This is something that I had thought about a little going into it, but I kind of just didn't realize that I'd be working with people who had like literally never used a smartphone before in their life. So like I was thinking about like, oh, where should we put the buttons that will feel intuitive to them? And like I ended up working with people who like it wasn't intuitive to them to like tap on the text box in order to type there, which I wouldn't have thought of, or like we made some test accounts for them, and they had like underscores and like the usernames and passwords, and they didn't know how to make it underscore on the phone, which actually is like not intuitive at all, because you have to go into like punctuation, and then you have to like capitalize your punctuation. It's like very confusing actually, but like it's just so natural to me that I didn't think of it. There were language barriers, which again we knew. We wrote the app in French. But like when we got there and people were using it, we didn't realize how bad some of our translations were. Like the word record is like a big part of the app, because like you save your records, like your files. But like the word that we were using was like, you broke the record in a race. And they were like, what is this? There's no tech support. If something breaks, there's nobody around to fix it or help with it. So like not only does everything have to be really reliable, but it also has to have kind of easy solutions in place so that if something goes wrong, they can try to like troubleshoot it themselves. And there are also trust issues. Like again, like people who weren't used to smartphones were hesitant to use them. They didn't trust the idea of the cloud at all. They were very stressed out about like not being able to see the server. So like I was going there expecting to have like technical discussions, but like a ton of our discussions were just like, how can we convince people that like this is an okay thing to use and do? And maybe it was naive of me not to think about some of this stuff, but I guess I was just so lost in the code base and some of these highly technical things that we did implement that it wasn't on my mind. And after I visited them and I met them, and then I went home and continued working on the project, all of these things were much more on the forefront of my mind. So we had to implement a lot of non-standard solutions. I did a ton of market research. You can hit a lot of considerations if you have the right hardware. We were lucky because we were in a position where like the NGO was providing the hardware. So we kind of got to decide what they were going to use. I did a ton of market research on printers. My house is full of printers. I was looking for stuff with like long battery life. Removable batteries were important, so they could like charge them somewhere else and then have them ready in case there was no electricity. It needed to be Bluetooth, because that's how we were going to connect. I spent a lot of time seeing how it handled like troubleshooting. Like some printers just blink lights. Some printers like give you words and explain to you what's wrong. So this isn't really how programming normally works, because normally we're very invested in like, we have to make sure this works on all devices. And I was like, I'm doing something very specific that's like really only going to work on like these specific devices, but it has to be perfect. This is another thing that's kind of not that much like how programming often works, because we're used to kind of, we want to use libraries, don't reinvent the wheel. But we had to build a lot of stuff from scratch. And that was like really frustrating, because we didn't feel like we were doing something like totally new that had never been done before, cutting edge. But because of this like very specific combination of constraints, like in some ways we kind of were, because a lot of the solutions like didn't really apply. We're like, oh, well this would work, but we'd have to lose like just one of our 6 constraints. That's not really how constraints work, so we couldn't do that. But we wasted a lot of time looking for like an existing solution. And if we had embraced this mindset at the start, like we might have to build stuff from scratch, we would have saved a lot of time. And the UI is just, what we ended up going with was completely different. It was like the step-by-step pop-ups that would be like, now turn on the printer. OK, now plug in the cord. OK, now unplug the cord. And it like wouldn't let you proceed until you've done each of these steps. I'm sure this would be like wildly frustrating to someone who like knows how to use a smartphone, because it makes you go so slow and do everything so intentionally. But we had people that were like struggling with the tech, and then like if they forgot how to do something, we didn't have someone there to guide them. So it was really necessary to like help them like go through all of these steps every time. So that was like a really interesting experience. And then after I left that consulting firm, I got a job at AgriList, where I work now. And so that's an agriculture company. So AgriList is basically an app that's designed to like help with the day-to-day for farmers and growers who work in like indoor farms and greenhouses. So it does like farm and labor management. It does seed to harvest tracking. It's got task management. It like integrates with climate control hardware. It does data analysis, yield predictions. It's pretty cool. And it also means that all of our customers are farmers. And that means that sometimes I get to go to their farms to like meet them and see their facilities, which is like extremely cool. And it's also a big similarity with what I was talking about with my MediCapt story, because I really believe that like you have to go see people working in like their natural environments to really understand their needs. Like that's how you can have empathy for them. So I'm going to talk about a few aspects of like what I've been working on at AgriList that kind of ping the same themes that I've been talking about, like thinking about what your users really need. So I mentioned language with MediCapt. That's been a challenge for AgriList also. We have a lot of customers in other countries. We have customers where like there's agricultural workers who aren't native English speakers working for farm owners that are native English speakers. And so it's really important to have the app in like languages that people can understand. So we used I18N for internationalization. That's like a really cool gem. It's like a lot of work, but it makes it pretty easy. I'm not really going to talk a lot about I18N because that's not really what the talk's about. So our app is right now in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. And it does make for like weird edge cases that like wouldn't have occurred to me. Like for instance, Arabic goes the other way, which is like challenging in an app. And so we were trying to be empathetic. We were like, okay, well, if we have the bar normally goes, like, it has the most important stuff at the right, and then it gets to the less important stuff. So maybe we should flip like the whole bar, so it'll feel more natural. But so then we did this code that just like flipped everything, and like some of the stuff is still like in English, and it just looks really silly. And like, I mean, of course, if you flip everything, this is what it's going to look like. But I didn't think about it. This is a particularly interesting one to me. So how do you pronounce AgriList in Spanish? You can't. It's like a completely unpronounceable nonsense word. And Spanish is like the main language of like a ton of our users. And so pronounceability in other languages was something that like hadn't really occurred to us early on, especially like when we named the company like years ago. That's probably not like something a lot of people think about every day, but it's really important. And so that's the kind of thing you have to revisit, especially if you're like a company that's growing. I think a lot about the layout and the UI, as I was talking about, you know, user-friendliness, this idea of something that's intuitive. User-friendliness basically means like, okay, well, it's simple and intuitive to use. But like, what makes something simple and intuitive? A lot of it relies on existing familiarity. Like, you often see the back button at the top left-hand corner of the screen. Is it actually like better in any empirical way to put the back button there? I don't actually know the answer to that. But I think that we're so used to the back button being in that same spot that it feels intuitive because that's kind of where we go to look for it naturally. So we're in the middle of a big refactor right now. And one of the things we're adding is this calendar view for tasks that we didn't have before. And like, why are we adding this view? Because we have a lot of customers that use Google Calendar, and they wanted something that like felt more like a Google Calendar to use. We have a mobile app now, and that was because we found out that like most of the farm employees that were working for our customers were like using phones in the field, and so we had this desktop app that we felt was like perfect and beautiful, but it didn't really matter because they were trying to use it responsively on these little phones, and it was like not, not ideal. And if you make the most perfect application in the whole world, but it's not available for the device that your users actually need it for, it's not very valuable to them. And so we realized that we like really needed to have a mobile app so that people could kind of interact with it in the way that worked for them. And like planning features is really the big one. Planning features is super hard. I mean, requirements gathering is hard in general. But if you don't have like a real solid understanding of your users' needs and like how they work day to day, then it's like incredibly hard. So this is just one example of like a feature that my team built that I never would have come up with on my own. We call it plant sites. So basically we have seeding units. Seeding units here is like trays and rafts. And we use them to track quantity, like, oh, I planted 15 trays of lettuce. But we also use it to track zone capacity, like, oh, I have a greenhouse and 50 trays can fit in it, and then we can calculate like how full the greenhouse is. Except it's not actually really useful on its own in that way, because we were using like decimal points for trays, because we're like, oh yeah, you could have like 1.5 trays of lettuce. That's useful for quantity. But that's confusing for capacity, because even if your tray is half empty, it's still physically taking up space in your greenhouse. And so it wasn't really reflecting it the way that people wanted. And so we introduced plant sites, so you could be like, oh, I have 120 plants in this tray, but 40 of them died. So now I know how many plants I have, but the tray is still there taking up space. So was this like an extremely complicated or technically involved feature? I mean, not particularly. But the only reason that it got suggested is because we had people who were actually talking directly to like the farmers that were using the platform and like working with them while we were doing requirements gathering. Because like I was at home thinking about like floats and integers, and it never would have occurred to me like this use case portion was kind of out of my scope of thinking. I also want to talk briefly about accessibility. It's not exactly a case study in the same way, because like I've never specifically worked on anything that's like specifically about accessibility, but it is something I think about a lot. This is also just like a tiny sliver. Accessibility is like a really huge category. Even if I did an entire talk, I wouldn't cover all of it. But there's a few accessibility issues that I wanted to mention because like they kind of, again, ping this same theme, like simple problems, low-tech answers. The only reason we're not doing it is because we didn't think about it. And I want to point this out again. Disabled people aren't the edge case. Tech people are the edge case. Tech people are the edge case. It's very easy to dismiss your users as like being the edge case. I see this all the time. In fact, I feel like this all the time. Like if I find out that a user triggered a bug by like interacting with my app in like a weird way, it's very tempting to be like, I don't know, why did they do that? Nobody does that. Like that's a weird edge case. But like obviously somebody does do it because they're doing it. My users are doing it, and so I have to like react to that rather than just like, dismiss it. I'm going to talk about screen readers. This slide, oops, oh no, sorry. This slide is also known as how to practice user empathy while on twitter.com. Some people use screen readers to experience the internet. If you've never used a screen reader or like tested with a screen reader, you might not realize like what a very different experience they're having from you. So what am I getting at? Alt text for photos is something that comes up a lot. I think people do think about this, although they don't always do it. But if there's a photo and there's alt text, then the screen reader can tell someone what that photo set is of. But if you take like photos or screen caps of text, rather than doing like a thread on Twitter, because you want more characters, screen readers can't read that, so they can't parse that. And then like this is another thing I see a lot on Twitter, Unicode fonts. Emoji. What do I mean by Unicode fonts? So this is something I feel like I see in people's screen names, like display names. This is my display name on Twitter, Jameson, son of Jame. And this is a bunch of different, like, these aren't real fonts. These are Unicode characters that look like letters, and so people will use them as fonts because they look cute, and you can use them on like places where you don't normally get to pick the font. But the problem is that like screen readers don't parse these as letters, so like they can't read it as like a word. So like if this was my username, a screen reader would say something like, you know, capital cursive uppercase J, capital cursive lowercase A, and it would like read it out rather than like saying the word. And if it's in your like display name, it's doing that for like every single tweet. Emoji is kind of like this too, you know. I love emoji. I really love emoji, so like I get it. But this is what a screen reader would read this tweet as.
If graphic emoji : clapping hand sign y'all, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign don't, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign quick, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign deleting, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign yeah, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign tweets, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign after, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign I, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign quote, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign am, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign making, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign me, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign look, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign stupid, graphic emoji : clapping hand sign.
I thought a lot about if I was going to make everyone listen to the entire thing, but I think it's very important to listen to the entire thing. Colors and design, I think, is something that people do think about, but maybe not always in the right ways. Lots of people are colorblind. If you use like colors that don't like contrast poorly, maybe you've thought about that before, because like that's something that's frustrating for anybody, but it's like way more frustrating for colorblind people. But in addition to that, we also use colors to like mean things in our design, like all the time. We use green for success messages and red for errors. I mean, like, you know, you probably also have text, but it's like harder to parse. It's also noteworthy that the red-green thing is like a really common color combo, and also that red-green color blindness is like the most common type of color blindness. So it's harder for colorblind people to like delineate, but sometimes it's like impossible. Like here, we have required fields marked in red. That's the only way that they're separate from each other at all. If there was like an asterisk additionally, then everyone could tell, but there's like, which would have taken 3/4 of 1 second to add, but obviously just nobody thought about it, and it would have been so easy to fix. So I pretty much used most of my time to talk about examples, but it's really talk about empathy, and I think that there's a few takeaways here about having empathy for people. Cultivating empathy for your users is essential for creating an app that actually works for them. Not for you, for them. Predicting what people's pain points will be in an app that doesn't like fully exist yet is really hard, and developers aren't really that good at it. That's why requirements gathering is so hard. That's like another thing that I could do an entire talk on. Maybe I will. You have to make sure that you're solving the right problems. You have to meet your users and get a feel for what it's like to be them. Sometimes we think we're practicing empathy, but we're really not. That's tough, because how do you really know? And that's kind of why I think it's so important that this meeting your users should be face-to-face and like in their natural habitat. Where do they live and where they do their work? Simple, clever solutions can often be just as valuable as highly technical solutions. We love highly technical solutions as programmers. We're so into the puzzle aspect of it. And like that's cool too, but it's just not the end-all and be-all. Like if we're doing something that's highly technical just for the sake of being highly technical because it's cool technology, but it's not actually impacting people's experience for the better, then there's not really value in it. There can be so much more value in taking the 3/4 of 1 second to put your asterisks next to your form. Fostering empathy will improve your applications, and it will improve the world. This was the last sentence of my proposal. I also wanted it to be the last slide of my talk. You can do something because it'll make your app or your website or your product better. And that's cool to do. It's great to make your stuff better. But it will also make you better, because it will give you a greater sense of understanding of other people. It'll make people around you better. It'll make your customers better. And that's cooler than cool. It's ice cold. Thank you for listening.